a little difficulty. I'm having a little difficulty with my camera, so I apologize. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this evening's presentation. My name's Dory Dalton. I'm your wildland specialist for the Genesee Fire Protection District, and we are excited to share with you the information we've gathered, the perceptions shared by you, and the survey responses. This data allows us to identify educational opportunities we can target for improved awareness and enhanced community preparation. We have set aside an hour for this presentation. It will be recorded and posted on the Genesee Fire website for later viewing. There will be a short Q&A at the end of this presentation, so please post your questions in the chat box. The chat box will be monitored and the questions will be answered, and if we're unable to get to your question, it will be answered and posted on the Genesee Fire Rescue website. So a little background: in January of 2021, there was a story on Colorado Public Radio about the work WiRē was implementing with another community, and we decided to reach out to the team. We feel really fortunate for the opportunity to partner with WiRē for a project based in our own community. All of the information that's presented tonight and related to the data you can find on our website. At this time, I would like to introduce the teams that have been a big part of our project. For Genesee Fire Rescue, Nancy Bolter and Scott Mefford from our board of directors, and Fire Chief Jason Puffett and myself have worked on the Genesee Fire Rescue side. And for the WiRē team, I'm going to introduce Hannah and then let her introduce her team. So Hannah Brinkert Smith is an environmental sociologist whose work examines social environmental interactions. She's a founding WiRē team member, a research associate professor at the University of Colorado Institute for Behavioral Sciences. And I will turn it over to her at this time.
Thanks, Dory and Chief Puffett, for having us here today. I'm going to share my screen so we get our presentation up. So our team is WiRē, and that's short for Wildfire Research, Y and Re, WiRē. And as Dory said, I've been working on wildfire as a sociologist for a while, and I sit at the University of Colorado Boulder, but most of my work has been with this collaborative team that's researchers and practitioners who are really working to support evidence-based local community wildfire education programs. And so part of what we do is certainly driven by our research world, but the main part, and what we're going to really talk about today, is how data collected at the local level can really help programs like the one at Genesee Fire Rescue to move forward with evidence-based programs. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Barth, who is one of my practitioner counterparts at Bureau of Land Management. I'm going to let him introduce himself.
All right, thanks, Hannah. Again, good evening, everybody. My name is Chris Barth. I'm a founding member of WiRē. I work for the Bureau of Land Management in Montana as the State Fire Mitigation Program Specialist. And I've been working in fire management for about 30 years, and I'm part of a command staff for a Type 1 incident management team. And although I live in Montana, I still think of Colorado as home. I lived there for 30 years and actually used to work up at Lookout Mountain Nature Center quite a long time ago. So familiar with your neck of the woods, the landscape, and such a beautiful community. So with that, we will go ahead and get started with our presentation. And again, I appreciate you all joining tonight, as was mentioned earlier by Dory. If you do have questions throughout the presentation, please go ahead and use the chat feature to type those in. We'll be monitoring that and try to answer them as we're going through it, and certainly address questions at the end. So the work that our team does is research embedded in practice, and we work to collect local data that's relevant to our partnering collaborators, so Genesee Fire Rescue in this case, as well as the broader research community. The approach is something we've been working on for the last decade, and in each iteration, we refine and improve our work, learning from each of those partnerships. So as you can see here, we've got 4 steps outlined. The first step is an introductory letter that explains that the effort is about to be launched. Folks that received surveys, and thank you for those that participated in the household survey and responded to that. You received an introduction letter letting you know that we were going to be working with Genesee and a little bit about the program. In step 2, on the right of your screen, there's a rapid wildfire risk assessment that's conducted. And again, in this case, folks from Genesee Fire Rescue went out and conducted they collected some data in the field for every property with a residential structure. And in fact, we looked at some non-residential structures in Genesee Fire Rescue as well. And so I'm going to talk about the details of that as we move into the next few slides. But first, I want to talk about step 3, and there's a household survey that's sent out to those owners of those same properties. So all the homes that we collect, the attributes that contribute to wildfire risk on each parcel also get sent a household survey. And Hannah's going to speak to some of the results and the findings from the household survey a little bit later. And then in step 4, we work with our partners to think through the results and what they mean for the community. And so we've done some of that in having conversations with Dory and Chief Buffett and kind of just looking at the results and starting to think about some next steps. And we'll talk about that as well at the end. And so community meetings like this one is a pathway to share the results with all of you and also to hear comments and feedback that can help shape how our partners move forward. Next slide. So the rapid assessment, or what we call the RA, and again, this is a rapid parcel level assessment. We look at each parcel in the study area. So the rapid assessment, or RA, we began working with Genesee Fire Rescue in early 2021, and worked on the training for Genesee Fire Rescue staff on conducting the rapid assessment using the WiRē tool that we've developed over many years and have been refining that as we go along, also with great feedback from our partners. And Genesee Fire conducted 1,387 assessments. And again, as I said earlier, most of those were residential parcels with about 47 non-residential parcels included in that. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the rapid assessment, or the RA overview. And again, this is something that's near and dear to my heart. Before I worked for the Bureau of Land Management, I worked in Colorado Springs with Colorado Springs Fire, and we did something very similar to this approach. And I've been working, with WiRē and our partners for years to develop a simple, usable tool for folks that they could help better understand the wildfire risk of homes in those communities, but also help make informed decisions about what actions residents like yourself could take. So the rapid assessment contains 13 attributes, and those fall into 4 categories. And you can see those in the color-coded squares or tables on the screen: access, background conditions, defensible space, and home ignition potential. And access includes things like address posting, ingress, egress, driveway clearance, both the clearance and the length. Background conditions includes things such as distance to dangerous topography, slope of the property, and fuels on adjacent properties. And defensible space includes vegetation near the home and presence or distance of non-vegetation combustibles near the home. And finally, the home ignition potential includes roofing materials, building exterior, combustible attachments such as deck and fencing, and then proximity to adjacent homes. And again, you can see, it might be hard to read, but again, the presentation and these materials will be available on the Genesee webpage after the presentation. But just wanted, for folks that can see, we highlight the attribute weight. So address posting is a relatively low weighting at 1%, whereas something like roof has a much higher attribute weight at 30% of the overall score. And these all add up to 1,000, and you can see the individual points for those choices. So these categories and the attributes are constructed based on science. So a lot of research and has gone into understanding how homes burn in wildland fires. And it's based on all that work over the years, what we've seen as homes, unfortunately, are destroyed during wildfires, and just understanding that nuance about how, what poses a risk to homes. Excuse me. So we're going to look at wildfire risk. And so when we started this project, Genesee Fire Rescue, and some of you probably familiar with this, was in the final stages of their CWPP process. So the map on the left shows a culmination of that great work. 4 steward guilds helped out with that in looking at fire modeling, things like fire risks, suppression challenges, evacuation hazards, et cetera. And in a lot of their data and providing that overall hazard ratings for the communities in the Genesee Fire Rescue service area or jurisdiction. So you can see that overall hazard rating on the far left. And then what our data enables is to see how the parcel conditions contribute to that story, many of which can constitute the parcel level characteristics that can be altered by you as a homeowner. And they are within the domain of that private property owner whose actions can help reduce risk on your parcels, as well as overall help reduce overall risk in the community. So the map on the right is the same Genesee Fire Rescue jurisdiction or service area with the CWPP areas and their relative risk ratings mapped by the 4 steward guilds in the CWPP. But on that backdrop, we also showed the rapid risk assessment data that Genesee Fire Rescue collected as part of this project with WiRē. And so you can kind of see, looking at them side by side, that parcel level risk is not necessarily the same as what we oftentimes call the landscape scale risk. In more of a coarse context, a lot of the work on the right in the CWPP community risk efforts do look at landscape scale risk and community scale risk at a course level, but the information that Genesee collected in these parcel risk assessments provides a very detailed look at the parcels within the community. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Hannah to continue on with talking about the household survey.
Thanks, Chris. So as Chris explained, the risk assessment was conducted. And then about a month later, when that was all completed, actually a couple months later, we started the household survey data collection process. And so that was comprised of a household survey that had an introductory letter and a return envelope. And hopefully you all remember having received that. And we received a 44.9% response rate, which is a really, really excellent response rate. It means that when Genesee Fire Rescue reached out to you, you reached back with your responses. And so as a result of that, we have, if you look at the right-hand side, we had 581 households that responded, where we could pair that risk assessment up with the household survey responses. Now that 45% response rate, it varied actually if you break it down by the community areas that make up Genesee. And so you can see that those varied across, but still overall, really, really good response rates. And we're very proud of that. And we feel like we can talk about some of these results with a great deal of confidence that it's really telling a story about what's happening in your community. So when we look at the overall risk ratings, if you look at this bottom right-hand corner, we can see the distribution of those risk ratings across a low, medium, a moderate, high, very high, and extreme risk categories. And because we have the parcels are all geocoded, we know where they all are in space, we can look at the different risk profiles in the different communities. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the coming slides. So we have the risk assessment. That's that map that Chris was referring to on the left. And then as part of the household survey, everyone was asked to evaluate their own properties. So you were asked a series of questions that use all the same attributes as Chris described in the risk assessment, the same attributes that were used to assess the properties. And then at the conclusion of that section, you were asked to, based on all of these conditions, how would you characterize the risk of your property? And so what we can do is we can look at those household survey responses of how you characterize your properties, and then we can also compare them to the risk assessment conducted by Genesee Fire Rescue. So on this slide, on the left side, you see the rapid risk assessment results. And you can see that 83% of the properties were characterized as having very high or extreme risk. That's those two bottom bars on the left side. Now, when we pair this up with the household survey responses, we see a really different story, a really different distribution of how respondents characterized their own risk. So we see that only 10% of household survey respondents thought that their property would be characterized as very high or extreme risk. And then we see that 55% thought that their property would be characterized as having moderate risk. So what we're seeing is that systematically respondents are underestimating their risk compared to what that risk assessment told Genesee Fire Rescue the conditions were in the community. So because we have this by community area, we can look, and Genesee Fire Rescue can use these data to look at the different community areas. So in Genesee Village, for example, we see that 83% of the properties were characterized as extreme risk, and that most respondents in that area thought that their property would be moderate risk. So this is a really important piece of information. One, the respondents in this area are underestimating their risk. And what we know from the risk assessment is one of the factors in Genesee Village is that the households are very close together. And so one of the pathways that we've talked about with Chief Puffett and with Dory is that the importance in Genesee Village, one of the things that is particularly important is residents working together on that shared risk, because those homes being situated so close together is part of what's driving the risk in that area. So so as I explained, we can look at the risk assessment data and the household survey data. And what we can do is we can actually break that down by risk attribute. So what you see here is the comparison of two factors that are really driving this risk gap, that gap between how the risk assessment characterized the risk and how household survey respondents characterized their own risk. And so defensible space, this graph in the top left, in the top line, you see the rapid risk assessment results, and in the bottom line, you see the household survey results. And so what we see is that there's really big differences in how the risk assessment characterized the risk in defensible space and how the homeowners, the respondents to the surveys, were characterizing it. There can be a number of different reasons why this gap is so dramatic here. One, we can, first of all, just acknowledge that when conditions are observed from the roadside, there may be some error in that. And obviously, people standing on their front step would see those conditions much more closely. So owners have a frontline view of that vegetation. But the important message here is that there's a lot of room for improvement, even if we acknowledge that there may be some error in those observations, that the conditions within that defensible space zone are relatively low cost actions that are relatively accessible actions that residents can take to reduce risk. So the figure in the bottom right is other combustibles. And again, we see that there's this pretty dramatic mismatch between what was observed through the rapid risk assessment and what was reported on that household survey. And so here, the same trend. And now other factors could be driving the differences here in terms of perhaps how people understand what is combustible. So the survey provided some examples: lumber, firewood, propane tanks being stored near the home are obvious combustibles. But there are other combustibles that the rapid risk assessment may have been picking up that homeowners perhaps didn't take into account. So a flammable doorstep mat or a flammable wreath on the door where embers could lead to home ignition. And so what we see here is an opportunity to talk about how a home might ignite and what low-cost steps can be taken to reduce risk. So here we have data on address posting and combustible attachments. So address posting that meets the current standards, which is posted and reflective, helps responders respond quickly and to communicate about locations. So it appears that the biggest gap here is whether those address signs are reflective which is important during an event when smoke or darkness can make it hard to see you. And this is another low-cost improvement that every owner can undertake in Genesee. Now, combustible attachments is a broad description that covers balconies, decks, porches, and fences. And they're important because they can carry fire to the home. And here again, we see, excuse me, a mismatch again, though perhaps not quite as dramatic. Excuse me. Okay. Oh dear. Chris, can you do the slide while I get my voice?
Sorry about that. So yeah, thank you, and apologize, Hannah. So yeah, looking at some of these risk caps again, I just kind of back up and start with the driveway clearance again. So again, not as much of a mismatch in the does not meet either, but certainly a big mismatch in the meets one but not both. And so, you know, someone as a practitioner, as somebody that looks at wildfire risk and has done a lot of these assessments, I look at things like you know, trying to model these standards, which are after local standards as well as pretty common national standards of what's acceptable for emergency apparatus, ingress and egress, and protecting your home. But a lot of times it's just, you know, people just don't understand. It's hard to gauge distances if it's not something that you're doing pretty commonly. So again, a lot of times people often miscalculate distances because it's not something that they're familiar with. It could be that they think that they have more, or the assessor saw it differently from their vantage point. And then ingress, egress, again, just touching on that one as well, looking at the importance of having two ways in or out of your community. And this is a challenging one, right? Because it's very difficult to add a secondary egress. But again, looking at the rapid assessment, this is an interesting one where, you know, they were close, but again, folks thought that they might have more ways in or out. And so when you're planning, when you're doing your wildfire preparedness and thinking about what kinds of things to take and what, you know, how you're going to get it out if there is a fire, it's really important to know what those ways in and out are. If you have to know them both and practice using them both. But here in the rapid assessment, in the household survey, more people thought that they had two or more roads in or out.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm back. So in the household survey, we asked people where they were getting their wildfire risk information and how useful it was. We also asked about the modes by which they shown. It's not shown here, but when people asked if they prefer to receive wildfire risk information by, oh dear goodness, so sorry.
Let me know if you want me to go again.
Nope, I got it. There we go. If we asked if they preferred it by social media, 80% of people said that no, they did not prefer social media. So while that is an inexpensive and quick way to get information out, it is not currently the preferred mode. And another note on information sharing was that 68% of respondents reported that they have talked with their neighbors about wildfire risk. And so this is an important dynamic within the community. The rate at which people are talking to their neighbors matters. Programs like FireWise are actually built on the assumption that this informal network of information exists and is being used to share information. And in most of the places where we have done this work, people who have talked with a neighbor about wildfire risk are doing more risk mitigation. So we also asked about acceptability of various pathways to reduce wildfire risk. And so what you see here is a series of pathways we asked about for reducing risk and how acceptable it is. So the dark green part, the bottom part of the bars, is the portion of respondents who reported that the pathways were extremely or very acceptable. And then the upper lighter green color is the portion of people who So I'm going to talk about two of these. So the first one, removing vegetation along roadways for safer evacuation. So we see that 85% of respondents thought this was extremely or very acceptable, and another 10% thought it was moderately acceptable. So this is deep and broad support for doing this kind of action. Away property surrounding communities. And again, we see 3/4 of respondents said this is an extremely or very acceptable action to reduce risk, and another 17% thought it was moderately acceptable. And so the way I interpret this 17% is that the details likely matter in terms of what that looks like. And so what this tells move that 17% from moderately, at least a portion of them, into being really on board with that effort. And again, you know, if Genesee Fire Rescue hears some voices of objection, there's still a great deal of evidence here that the majority of these more about vegetation management. These were about broader building and development measures. So let's look at the second bar. We asked about how acceptable it is to adopt building codes that require fire-resistant materials for structures located in fire-prone areas of Genesee Fire Rescue. So we see that 74%, or nearly 3/4, found this to be extremely or very acceptable. And again, like the last item, there's a portion here, 18%, who thought that this was moderately acceptable. And so again, I interpret this to mean that most respondents have given support to this pathway, and that there's this other portion where the details likely really matter. And so this is completely logical. If you're going to make a change to the world in which you live, it's likely that those details really matter. And so conversations about that can help elucidate which details to focus on. And then if we look at this fourth bar, we see that we asked about how acceptable it was to build a new road to provide emergency evacuation route. And as the CWPP highlighted, there was, I think in 2013, there was a traffic study that showed congestion with an evacuation drill that was done. And that work supported a focus on evacuation. And so here we see that 59% find building a new road to provide emergency evacuation route extremely or very acceptable. And again, about 18% are choosing this middle category that's moderately acceptable, but the details of that probably really matter. Okay, and in my last slide, part of our work entails asking about the beliefs about wildfire, and these help us understand respondents' general orientation to wildfire. And so for these items, respondents were asked, how much do you agree or disagree with the following statements? And so it could go from strongly agree to strongly disagree. we see that the vast majority of respondents believe that or agree that homeowners' actions to reduce wildfire risk are effective, that we should be putting out fires that threaten homes, that their properties are at risk of wildfire, and that wildfires are part of the balance of a healthy forest or ecosystem. And so since these 4 items and the responses really align, it tells us that most respondents are very aligned together within this community on wildfire risk. And that's an important piece of it, right? In terms of thinking about whether or not people are thinking the same way about wildfire risk in a community, or if there are really varied ideas about wildfire. And then, so for the last 2 slides, we asked about the extent to which people believe that development in fire-prone areas in Genesee Fire Rescue increases risk to their own personal property. And we see that 43% agreed or strongly agreed with that. And then nearly the same portion, just a little bit less than that, neither agreed nor disagreed, which means that there's a conversation to be had about that middle category, right, is a kind of a big I don't know. And so it's a place to have conversations about the interaction between wildfire risk and development. And likewise, the question about community wildfire, wildfire and community water supply. We see that fire threatens community wildfires, community water supply, and more were kind of really in this I don't know. They neither agreed nor disagreed, which is a real opportunity to have a conversation about the very real relationship between wildfire and water quality, water availability. And so then the last one that I want to highlight is this last item on the far right. We ask a series of questions about beliefs about local firefighting resources. And we see that only 16% agree or strongly agree that local firefighters have sufficient resources to protect threatened homes. And then a big group of people are just kind of not sure. They're in this neither agree nor disagree. And this is really important because Genesee Fire Rescue has this enormous responsibility and a pretty big community to serve. And so having conversations about available resources, what a fire looks like, what it looks like when resources are set out to go respond to a fire is really important in terms of setting expectations and also for understanding the role that homeowners can play in terms of reducing the risk and helping all of the community move to a safer and more resilient community. And so with that, since we want to leave time for questions and for Dory, just going to talk more about Genesee Fire Rescue and all the great work that's happening here, I'm going to turn the floor over.
All right. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Chris. So just again, I just want to remind everyone that all of this data that's shared and the information related to this project can be found on our website, along with this recording and the slide deck. All right. So some current ongoing efforts that we are doing right now. We have plan unit presentations happening. I think we have 3 more before we wrap up that series of 16. You can plan a neighborhood walk. We do that quite often. Again, home assessments are happening. There is a monthly HOA working group. We're currently working on a community evacuation plan and evaluating the creation of an evacuation road. Some upcoming initiatives we have is to evaluate the project scope for a post-fire recovery plan, conduct a CWPP review. We're in the process of developing a community e-letter based on the feedback from you, and then assessing the need for expansion of our current home assessment program. So those are some of the things we have going on right now. Is anyone going to put any more questions in the box?
For those who are maybe not reading the questions in the chat, somebody asked about
the size of the risk gap implies to me that more education is needed. So is there a plan within Genesee Fire to accomplish that? And again, you know, Dory, you did touch on those initiatives and some of the information that's out there. Did you want to add anything more to that question at this time?
No.
Okay, yeah. And there was a question asked earlier on, is there a recommended supplier for reflective address signage? And Dory, I believe you put a link in there answering that question, but just so folks see it, that there is some information about reflective address signs on the webpage.
Yeah. And the link, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, the link I just put in the chat box will link you to all of the links we've been putting in the chat box. So it'll just take you to a page.
Gotcha. And then there was another one that I think is an interesting one. So what is the takeaway from the risk gap? Do homeowners need to be better educated? Again, talking about some of that and looking at some initiatives. And I think that's an interesting philosophical question. So I'm gonna sit at that, but see if Hannah or Jason or Chief Buffett want to take a first stab at that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Chris. The question is an interesting one because we look at this typically from an operational point of view. And when we do that, we think about resources, we think about how we respond to the incident. And then the next level is what are the community members doing about reducing this risk for the sake of themselves, their neighbors, but also the firefighters responding. So are we at a greater risk without having this knowledge? You know, I would argue yes. I think to understand is going to result in empowering. And then once a community is empowered with knowledge, I hope to see action. And there's a lot of good action going on, but to continue that action, to carry that forward, will make a difference in terms of reducing, not eliminating, but reducing our overall wildfire risk.
Thank you. And I think just to answer that question from kind of a WiRē standpoint, so those not understanding or not recognizing vulnerabilities is not something that, is looked at as an attribute to come up with your partial level risk assessment. So just to answer that question, yeah, as Chief Buffett said, by understanding your risk, hopefully folks, and we see folks becoming more aware, taking more action, and becoming more engaged as they understand what actually are vulnerabilities around the property and what they can do about them. But I just wanted to clarify, that not understanding or recognizing vulnerabilities doesn't count against you in the risk assessment.
I was also asked by someone if, while we were doing the rapid assessments, if wind was taken into account. Yeah, so, and I'll speak from, and I know that folks from Genesee Fire responded to the Marshall Fire, and as I said, one of the things that I do is I'm part of a Type 1 incident management team, and or make their homes more survivable. Having a hardened structure, including the siding, the roof, and other elements, but particularly those, as we're looking at the rapid assessment, are critically important in reducing your home's risk. So those fire brands, and again, we see it mosely on wood shake shingle roofs being a vulnerability as they land on a roof.
Siding is a little bit different because of the vertical orientation. But one of the things that I took out of this question, and I appreciate Chris asking this, is there are some fires, and you know, we often call these like the 2% fires, because we're really effective at you know, extinguishing 98% and you know, making sure that we don't have these really bad fires most of the time. But sometimes there are those 2% fires, those big fires, where you know, there's going to be quite a lot of challenges in protecting and keeping destruction out of communities when a fire occurs in a wildland urban interface. At a significant cost, just as replacing your roof. But you know, so when you have those conditions, it's important to really look outside of the structure and what you can do to manage your vegetation, the other combustibles around your home. Really making sure that there aren't things that will be exposed to some of those embers. And as people know, those come in an ember shower, thousands of them, and then get something combustible started that then burns for a long time and then causes a vulnerable material to weaken and succumb to fire. So I don't want people to think that, you know, like no matter what you do, you're going to be, you know, you're going to be in trouble, because there is quite a lot that people can do, and that's why we all do this work. But I certainly understand that, you know, there are some times when there's going to be those fires, and that's why, you know, this isn't a your home is going to survive, your home is not going to survive, because there are quite a lot of nuances with fire behavior. And
Chief Buffett or Dory, is the reservoir accessible by firefighting helicopters?
It is. So our partners at the Water District have done a really nice job of building reservoirs to protect our supply as a community water supply, but they also have designated that as a dip site that we've used in the past, and to very good effect. That's an excellent fire mitigation or fire operational tool for us. So we certainly appreciate that.
great. There's another comment in here. As a homeowner, we just signed up for an assessment.
To complete an application, and then I am notified about that, and then I send you an appointment link and we set up an appointment. The assessment takes about 2.5 hours. It's on your home ignition zone and your defensible space. We walk around your home and we look at things that we can do to help prevent embers from igniting your structure. You can choose to implement them or not. If you choose to and want me to come back out to check those recommendations, I can do that. And you can receive a certificate of mitigation that's good for 3 years. And people will say, well, what is that good for? You can share it with your insurance company if you wish, to show the effort that you're making. And it's also a great selling point for your home. So I am scheduled out quite a ways. But I think it's worth the wait. Everyone whose home I've visited with has taken something away from it. And it's been a really great way to just have a conversation about reducing risk.
Great, thanks, Dory. And I did go ahead and put that link in for you while you're talking.
Thank you.
There's a question here, probably for you, Chief Buffett. Areas to the east and west are heavily forested. Is Genesee Fire Rescue approaching those neighbors about wildfire risk?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Most of the property that's around our district is privately owned. We do have Denver Mountain Parks to the west, and to the south, we have Jefferson County Open Space. We do work with them and try to partner with them to reduce our fuel loads in those directions. When it comes to private property, we have made some attempts, but again, it's a very complicated topic to go after to try to reduce those large parcels when it's owned privately. That's something that we'd like to partner with our HOAs and our partners around the community as well to help drive that and see if we can reduce some of those fuel loads and thus our overall risk.
I also see a question in the chat box about fire retardant paints or stains. And yes, there are those products out there, but I don't want you to rely heavily on those just because thinking about where we live and thinking about applying those to wood and given, you know, our weather and thinking about the shrinking
intumescent paints. Another thing, you know, you touched on the weather. Another really important thing in Colorado is all the UV, you know, with all the days of sun in Colorado, there really are no guarantees of how long those last. And so, yeah, you can see some really great results if you put it on in a controlled environment.
Steps for Genesee Village?
Well, I think that's a great question. You know, I would really love to see the Genesee Village become a Firewise community for sure. You know, that would be great. I'd love to do some neighborhood walks in there and just see some groups come together just to have some conversations about how to reduce risk. And then also just thinking about some of their open spaces that could definitely use some
the discrepancy we saw in the risk assessments to the household surveys was the most dramatic in that community. And the question is, well, why? And to me, that's an invitation for us to come out, to work with you, to talk about that and answer that why. I think what we'll find is, one, is we may not understand all the different things, but on the same coin of
my little bit of my geek world to the table here, which is, you know, sometimes people respond to these comparisons between the risk assessment and the household survey as if it's some kind of gotcha game where there's some kind of attempt to show there's, I don't know, some like trick homeowners or cast them in a bad light. But what this is an opportunity, as Chief Puffett just said, is to have conversations, to do the walk with Dory. Those interactions as they happen, if they happen again and again, that shared understanding grows. And then pathways that maybe didn't exist previously in anybody's understanding can start becoming evident. They can start to evolve and emerge. And so I love hearing both Chief Puffett and Dory saying these things about the pathway, because the research from the social science in terms of risk communication There's a question here about safety zones within Genesee if a fire starts near I-70 and the exits are blocked.
Yeah, I'll take that one. And this is a message that it's a very uncomfortable message, but one that we need to do a better job of communicating. It's our responsibility to educate with truth and be very blunt when necessary, so that we all can understand our risk and we can mitigate that risk. So to answer your question directly, no, there's not a safety zone within our community. And that is why we need to continue to work and to become educated. And that starts with knowing what our risk is. It builds to have that evacuation plan. Your best bet is if and or when that situation occurs is to get out early so it doesn't become. And then the third is what happens if we are stuck? What happens if we don't have that option? We need to be educated on what to do in that situation. But there are no safety zones that we can rely on, both as firefighters as well as community members.
I'll take a stab on this most recent one and then hand it off because I'm sure Chief Puffett might have something to add as well. But how prevalent and effective are private insurer provided firefighting services, and do they interfere with local firefighters? So for folks that firefighting, but they have a response, mobile response group of folks that are trained in wildland firefighting to come out and do some preparations around homes that they have coverage for. So especially some of the top tier insurance providers, they do have that. And when there's a fire in an area, they send these resources out and protect the policyholders. And a lot of times, some of those groups work together so that one or two fire engines can go and do work on say 10 homes in the area. So they, again, making sure that if there's some limbs that need to be trimmed to, prevent fire from spreading to the house, et cetera, they do some work and then monitor that to make sure that, there's something being done. So as far as do they interfere, they do not. When we have incident management teams, they're very integrated into our efforts. I know that my team, we put them on what we call our incident action plan. We know where those resources are. They're connected with the operational folks that are working to suppress the fire and do that type of work. They're tied in with the local fire districts that are doing structure protection. So they are very much integrated. And again, some of that varies depending on where you're at, but they are integrated into our overall fire management and fire suppression efforts. And they're there to look after the select properties that they have, that their policyholders have. Jason, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you did a nice job. These folks that come in, it's really important from an accountability and safety standpoint that we get them integrated into the overall operation. But it can be challenging, but for the most part, it works fairly well.
And Chief Puffett or Dory, I think there's a good one here for one of you that came in. If 50% of Genesee homes used a garden hose to fight fire, would we have enough water pressure?
So I'm certainly not a water supply expert, and I'll defer to my partners at the water district, but the situation as a whole in our community is we are a gravity fed system. So what that means is we take water all the way down to Bear Creek by Lair the Bear and pump it up through treatment processes and then up to tanks at higher elevations. And then when you call upon water in your community or your home, you open up your tap and it's just gravity that brings that water from that tank down into your home. So one of the common things or very quick things to occur during a wildfire is we're going to shut power down to an area. And to replenish those storage tanks, we're going to be unable to do that relatively early in that incident. And so what we're going to have is what we're going to have. And the water district has a tremendous design and storage capacity and done a wonderful job of supporting us as a community. But at some point that could potentially become an issue. And that depends more on, I don't know about garden hoses, I don't know about the overall volume, but I'll tell you my experience at Marshall was we could hear the water trickling as the houses went down. And what was happening was the water lines coming in, a 3/4 inch or 1 inch line coming to the house, burned, severed, and failed. The water was still flowing. So each house that was lost continued to flow water, as well as the firefighting efforts that were ongoing using the hydrants depleted the water supply up there very quickly. And they also have a very robust water system. So to answer your question, it's very possible that that could happen. And that's something that we don't want folks to do, is diminish our overall water supply, because that's going to affect the critical areas where it can be utilized and have greater effect than not in one area versus another. So though we have a great water supply, we do need to be cautious with how we use that water supply.
Yeah, thank you. And I think while we're looking at some other questions, there was a follow-up question. I think it was related to the insurance. David, if I'm mistaken, please go ahead and put some additional comments in the chat. But you said, what is a select property? And again, I think that was related to my comments about insurance. So the best thing to do is check with your insurance provider for your homeowner's insurance and see if they do provide that. As I mentioned, it's the different insurance companies may offer that. They sign up and contract through outfits that have these resources, these firefighting or engines with firefighters on them to go out to protect properties. And it's typically higher tier. Sometimes there's different criteria, like the home value is $1 million or more. That's changing again as more and more insurance companies look to this as an option. So my best answer to that is check with your insurance company, see if it is something they offer, and it is limited. Chubb, some of those companies, and I'm trying to think of all the names of the ones that I know, but there's just a small group of insurance providers that are doing it right now, and I would doubt if more and more will add that on at some point. But check with your insurance company.
I'll add in here that the majority of respondents to the household survey thought that they were adequately insured for wildfire, for a loss. And as we saw in the Marshall Fire and the East Troublesome Fire, a large portion of people who lost their homes were underinsured. And so it is a reminder to have a conversation about your policy and what it covers to make sure you are adequately insured.
I know we just have 1 more minute left, but here's a question that I don't think we addressed yet, and I'll direct it to Chief Buffett or Dory. My understanding is Jefferson County building codes require defensible that, and maybe kind of talk about building codes or ordinances in general.
Sure, I'll just provide a brief overview. So Jefferson County adopted Appendix Z, and what that is, it's a variant, it's a customized version of the Wildland Urban Interface codes. And this was a big first step for the county to take on exactly what this question is referring to, and that's to provide the defensible space evaluation and to replace materials when we do upgrades or home improvements with ignition resistant materials. And that's a critical step for all of us. But what they provided, it's good, but there's much that can be done to improve it beyond where it currently is. And that work is ongoing. We're meeting with planning and zoning and the building departments on a very regular basis. The fire chiefs throughout Jefferson County have signed a letter in support of adopting the full International WiRē code to protect our communities as a whole. All 7 mountain areas are on board with that and united on the fact that this is a real critical piece to solving our not immediate situation, but this is our long-term situation. And it's really important that we start that immediately. So as those improvements happen, we can continue to improve upon that. Right now, we're looking at some interim updates through county code, but the real big changes I would expect will be put up for discussion and hopefully approval in 2024 and put into place with contractors in 2025. So these things do take time, but there's a lot of work underway to achieve that goal.
All right, I have 7:01. And so what I want to do is I want to remind everyone that all of the data and the information related to this project and the things discussed this evening can be found on our website, and we will put the recording on there in the next few days. I want to thank everyone for spending this hour with us. We really appreciate it. A huge thank you to the WiRē team. This has been a great project and you've been great partners, and we just so appreciate everything you've done with us. Community members, please reach out. All of my information, you can come to the website, you can call me. I look forward to having a community walk with you or doing an assessment. So again, thank you everyone so much for joining us this evening.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.